Okay, good afternoon everybody. Welcome to the second 3CL seminar of the year. And I'm delighted to introduce one of our own for a change, Elizabeth Howell, who's Law and May Lecturer in Corporate Law in this faculty. Elizabeth, in a former life, was actually a solicitor at Slaughter and May before she became a Slaughter and May Lecturer here. And she's previously taught at Oxford University and a number of places, including Merton College as a stipendiary lecturer before crossing over the divide, and delighted to see her coming here to Cambridge. And Elizabeth's here to talk about her principal field of expertise, financial market regulation, and in particular the supervisory role of the European Securities and Markets Authority. As a standard practice, we'll have questions during the second part of the seminar, but for the first half hour or so, I'll hand over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Mark, and hello everyone. So today this talk is on some work I've been doing about ESMA's role as a Direct EU Watchdog. And I've tried to select some relevant parts from this paper I've been thinking about. I'll try and keep this to about 30 minutes because I'd be interested in getting your input and thoughts on this area I've been working on. But the presentation today is in three parts. So firstly, there'll be a bit of an overview about the area I've been working on. We'll then think a bit about ESMA's work sort of in action as a direct supervisor, so a few sort of case studies. And then we'll think about the prospects for the future for ESMA as a direct supervisor. So what are the hurdles, stumbling blocks to future transfers of power to ESMA, and what are the possibilities? Okay then, so it's a pretty commonplace observation today to say that since the crises, we've had a huge regulatory overhaul in the EU. And the changes haven't just been of a regulatory nature, we've also seen changes to the institutional framework. Specifically, resulting from the Jacques de la Rosière report, we have the rise of the three ESAs, the European Supervisory Authorities. And the one we're concerned with today is ESMA, the securities sector ESA. Now, respecting treaty principles of subsidiarity and proportionality, the vision was that day-to-day supervision would very much be at the member state level. But one exception to this concerns credit rating agencies. And here we see that supervisory oversight has been transferred to ESMA. Why has oversight been transferred to ESMA here? Well, credit rating agencies can issue ratings that affect a large number of countries. So practically, really, it made much more sense for ESMA that has sort of EU-wide oversight to take responsibility for supervising the CRAs. This hasn't been the sole exception to the rule, however. We see that ESMA's also been granted direct day-to-day supervisory and enforcement powers over trade repositories under EMIR. Likewise, although not related to day-to-day supervision, we also see related developments with respect to short selling regulation, where ESMA has direct powers to intervene in the markets in emergency circumstances, and also with the forthcoming MiFID reforms. When we think about the future, though, there are a number of major stumbling blocks to any further shifts of power to ESMA. There are long-standing constitutional concerns based on the seminal Moroni doctrine that basically provides that only clearly defined, very strictly precise sort of powers can be transferred to EU agencies that are capable of review. There are also practical constraints. So ESMA's increasing workload over the years hasn't been met by an increase in ESMA's budget and human resources. We also see political issues. So for instance, there are fiscal stumbling blocks. So the argument is that where a member state and the national taxpayer is going to be the person picking up the bill if a market actor fails, this reinforces arguments in favour of keeping supervision at the member state level. This is not a static landscape, however. Before the Brexit vote this summer, we saw some hints as suggesting that there could be some increasing centralisation of powers to ESMA, particularly in a report termed the Five Presidents Report, the Five Presidents, various bodies within the EU. And now, following the unexpected Brexit vote over the summer, we may now see some shifts towards further centralisation of powers and a more integrated type of approach arising. And really the question when we come back to ESMA is, will further enhancements to its role happen incrementally the way it's always happened, or might we now start to see a more explicit shift towards perhaps creating a type of EU direct watchdog? So then, part two. To think about ESMA's role in action so far, the focus of today's presentation is really on ESMA's role, not the CRA's per se, but a few introductory remarks help sort of contextualise this. So, credit rating agencies are companies that issue ratings concerning the creditworthiness of issuers and also of financial instruments. And credit rating agencies became very much caught up in the issues surrounding the subprime crisis and came in for a lot of heavy criticism during both the financial crisis, largely due to some of the ratings that were being issued with respect to far more exotic types of financial instruments, and also then subsequently in the Eurozone crisis, where particularly we saw political allegations suggesting that CRAs were perhaps exacerbating that crisis by downgrading particular countries. The long and the short of that is we've had 3 rounds of EU reforms on credit rating agencies at the EU level. And from an oversight perspective, we see day-to-day responsibility being transferred to ESMA. Now, on a related point, this transfer of power happened pretty smoothly. Why? Well, Professor Ferran identifies 2 main reasons. Firstly, there were no major national interests. So, in the credit rating agencies industry, we very much got the dominance of the 3 big players, the 3 big US CRAs. So there were no sort of protectionist interests operating in relation to various particular member states. Secondly, although credit rating agencies are influential, they are nevertheless a small part of the financial markets, meaning that sort of concerns about fiscal responsibility ending up with a member state was going to be, those concerns were not really major. There were no sort of worries about, for instance, systemic risk. So in practice then, ESMA has a wide range of supervisory powers at its disposal, ranging from the ability to engage in inquiries, carry out investigations, on-site inspections and so forth. And one sort of tool it's utilised increasingly is to engage in thematic investigations. So a good illustration of this is a sovereign ratings investigation that ESMA ran for about 9 months in 2013. Now this investigation took place before the 3rd wave of CRA changes, but it's still salient for us to think about this because it helps to illustrate that ESMA has been willing to engage in quite ambitious and politically sensitive work on its watch. Now, ESMA focused on a range of areas with respect to sovereign ratings activities, including their governance, their organisation, confidentiality controls, and it was a thorough and also a critical investigation. So a number of major deficiencies were highlighted, including lead responsibilities being allocated to newly hired staff, delays in publications, problems of unauthorised disclosures to those not involved in the rating activities. This led to significant changes. So individual plans were put in place for each of the credit rating agencies. So this investigation focused on the 3 big credit rating agencies. ESMA continued to monitor the implementation of these plans on an ongoing basis, and also, as we'll see later, it also led to enforcement action against Fitch, one of the big 3 players. Now, it may well have been that the higher political salience of the sovereign ratings industry was the catalyst for this investigation. But nevertheless, it does highlight that ESMA was willing to embrace its responsibilities and try and start developing a reputation as a type of proactive supervisor who wants to try and drive change in this industry. Now, credible supervision needs to be accompanied by an effective sanctioning regime. Now, with respect to the CRAs and ESMA, giving ESMA enforcement powers proved to be more controversial, and in fact the Commission initially advocated that it was going to keep the enforcement powers for itself. However, in the end, ESMA was granted these powers, but these powers are very closely restricted and curtailed and confined. So there's a highly rigid procedural framework, very much due to the constitutional sensitivities around Moroni that ESMA has to comply with, and its discretion is very limited in this area. But in the event that after an investigation has taken place, that ESMA's Board of Supervisors considers that there's been an infringement, it can instigate a supervisory measure that can include revoking a rating agency's registration, or it could publish a censure, and if an infringement has been carried out negligently or intentionally, then there's a possibility of imposing a financial penalty. Now, to date, we see that ESMA has been engaged in 3 enforcement actions, and I've proposed to focus on 2 of these today. The first one against S&P, and then the most recent one where we see a large fine being imposed against Fitch recently. So, first out of the blocks was S&P, and this was a censure for failing to meet certain organisational requirements in the rules. And what happened was, this was to do with again, this was around the sovereign debt crisis time, and S&P was producing these BICRAs, what it termed as assessments of banking systems in various countries. And according to S&P, these weren't credit ratings, these were BICRAs. However, the technical sort of specifications led to BICRAs being kept in the same database as the credit ratings, and you may see where this is going. It led to the BICRAs being treated as if they were credit ratings. And what happened was this led to an erroneous email alert being sent out to subscribers of S&P's, subscribers to S&P that basically suggested that France's credit rating had been downgraded when it hadn't. And this occurring during the midst of the sovereign debt crisis understandably led to uproar in France amid suggestions that its prized AAA status was at risk. On the facts, actually, it turned out that France's credit rating was then actually downgraded a couple of weeks later, although in reality it didn't actually really impact that much on France's borrowing costs. In terms of the investigation, though, ESMA found there were a number of control failures within S&P. So there was a lack of responsibility for this project. Staff were inadequately informed. There was insufficient oversight. For instance, the person who had approved the upload had completely forgotten that the BICRA information was there and that it was being shown with the credit rating. Now, you might think that after all of that, that only sort of issuing a censure is quite a cautious start by ESMA. And indeed, the press suggested that this did fall short of the tough action that politicians were wishing to see in relation to the credit rating agencies. Nevertheless, legally, ESMA wasn't convinced that this infringement had been carried out negligently or intentionally, so it couldn't therefore impose a fine. It's certainly one way or other a helpful case study to other credit rating agencies for how to get their houses in order, and also a signal perhaps to them that ESMA is willing to engage in enforcement action. Turning then now to think about the most recent action, where we saw quite a steep fine being imposed on Fitch this summer for a series of negligent infringement, a fine of over €1 million. This related again to a series of infringements that stemmed from ESMA's prior work and particularly its sovereign ratings investigation that we looked at earlier. Now, what happened here was there was a number of infringements, including senior analysts passing on information on forthcoming ratings actions to the parent company, one of Fitch's parent companies, even though they weren't involved in the production of the credit ratings. And this happened over about an 18-month period. Secondly, the Fitch failed to allow a country sufficient time to process and respond to a credit rating before it published it. And thirdly, there were substantial shortcomings again in Fitch's internal controls. Now, clearly this fine, 1.38 million, is the largest fine imposed so far. I didn't linger long on the little table, but the other fine we've seen so far, DBRS, was around 30,000 euros. So Fitch is standing out here as being the largest one we've seen so far. And it does re-emphasise that ESMA is willing to get involved with its enforcement responsibilities. However, if we juxtapose it starkly with fines that the US regulator can impose, the difference is stark. So a recent penalty imposed on S&P by the US regulator amounted to $77 million. And this has led some commentators to suggest that ESMA has perhaps been quite timid in comparison. Now, that may be so, but one way or other, we should first of all be cautious about making straightforward comparisons. Firstly, we see two very distinct systems, the US on the one hand and the EU on the other, and linked to that, we've seen that ESMA can only impose fines within carefully confined circumstances and a very strict procedural framework. Further, the literature hasn't yet really come to a conclusion of what is the best way to measure enforcement's intensity or effect. So, for instance, looking at the size of a financial penalty fails to perhaps factor in the deterrent effect that there could be from other tools. So that could include, for instance, reputational sanctions. However, in the realms of credit rating agencies, the risk of reputational loss failed to act as an effective deterrent here in the past, so it's questionable whether this could have any impact in this area. More recently, actually, in fact, quite hot off the press, we now see the Commission stating at the end of last week that it's now considering that the current level of sanctions that ESMA can impose don't seem proportionate to the turnover of the large rating agencies, which is suggesting that the fines do not in fact have a deterrent or dissuasive effect in practice. And so really the Commission's view on this report is that it's going to now come back and reflect on the sanctioning regime, take into account other shifts we see with respect to sanctioning in other EU legislation, and that it may be revising the sanctioning setup going forward. Nevertheless, one way or other, when we come back to ESMA, what's clear for us to think about today is that it's still very much early days with respect to ESMA engaging in enforcement action, and within the confines that it can currently operate, it's imposed a fairly steep fine on Fitch, and it has certainly shown that it has an appetite for direct enforcement action. Turning though to think about a few of the other post-crisis measures where ESMA has been given a direct role. In the context of EMIR, ESMA also has direct day-to-day oversight over the trade repositories. So due to concerns about transparency surrounding derivatives trading during the crisis, what happens now is firms have to report their derivatives trades to these trade repositories, who act as a type of middleman. They store the data, and that can then be made available to the regulators. And this is again based on the, ESMA's powers are again based on the framework we saw with the credit rating agencies. So there's a similar setup in relation to supervision and enforcement. And again, to date, we see one enforcement action so far, again earlier this year, against the largest EU-registered DTCC derivatives. And this led to a fine of €64,000. Now, this basically related to considerable delays in providing regulators with access to the data. So over a 9-month period, these delays increased from 2 to 62 days and affected billions of reports. And this was very much due to, in ESMA's view, DTCC's negligence. Also, once DTCC realised there was a problem here, that these delays were occurring, it failed to actually get in touch with ESMA and say there's a problem here, and then it was also pretty slow off the mark at then getting a remedial plan in action to fix the situation. Now again, this fine may seem to be again relatively modest, especially given that there were aggravating factors, including the length of the time that these infringements had been going on for. But in this case, the press coverage, although quite limited again, did say it would have been embarrassing for one of the world's most important market infrastructure organisations. So again, it's very early days here with respect to the TRs and enforcement action, but it again reiterates to us that ESMA's showing that it's taking an ambitious approach and getting involved with enforcement work. Now, just briefly thinking about some other post-crisis developments with ESMA, although not related to day-to-day supervision, we see that ESMA has a bigger role to play in the realms of the short selling regulation. So ESMA has a familiar suite of supervisory tools. It also has a type of facilitation role if national regulators take emergency action on short selling. And also ESMA also is able in emergency exceptional circumstances to directly intervene itself in the market and, for instance, prohibit short selling if a number of fairly confined sort of tests are satisfied. And crucially, such action prevails over national regulatory action. Now, linked to, yes, actually that's a good point. Just to note, before I mention the MiFID developments, ESMA has not yet made use of these direct powers under the short selling regulation, so it still somewhat remains to be seen what use it makes of those. We see again some similar shifts, again not to do with day-to-day supervisory responsibilities, but also again an increasing role for ESMA in the forthcoming MiFID reforms that are currently delayed. With a more sort of consumer flavour to them, we see these type of direct temporary product intervention powers. And again, these enable both the national regulator and ESMA in confined circumstances to actually intervene in the market and prohibit the sale of financial instruments if, for instance, there are serious investor concern issues. For our purposes today, what this illustrates is that we're seeing some more incremental shifts here and an increasing role for ESMA with respect to its ability to intervene and engage in the markets on a day-to-day basis or in emergency circumstances. But looking to the future, we should first of all reflect on a few recent views we've seen of ESMA's role so far as a type of watchdog in action. So, firstly, the founding father of the ESA, Jacques de la Rossi, considered that ESMA has been performing well and become a recognised international authority. Likewise, the Commission's taken the view that there's broad consensus as to how ESMA is getting on with its mandate so far, and that there could be room to transfer further powers to ESMA going forward. A slightly more sort of ambiguous report comes from the Court of Auditors. This focused particularly on ESMA's role in relation to the credit rating agency, in relation to the credit rating agencies. Sort of took the view that, yeah, things have sort of started well, we've got good foundations, but there is room for improvement. So, for instance, the report highlighted that the lack of a document trail made it quite tricky to understand why some risks had in fact been reprioritised by ESMA. So, this report made a number of recommendations, these broadly related to sort of record keeping and decision making trails and processes, and ESMA in the main accepted these recommendations from the report. In terms of ESMA's own view as to its role and the future, it's a bit ambivalent as well. On the one hand, we see the creation of a single supervision department. So the vision is it's sort of combining the expertise it's been so far with the rating agencies and the TRs, and it's going to use this to enhance things going forward. And for the next few years, this shift is very much towards supervision and also the related issues of supervisory convergence. However, it did stress that it's not asking specifically for any new areas of direct supervision. However, then on the other hand, it also acknowledged it was willing to take on new tasks if those are assigned along with appropriate resources, which takes us into stumbling block 1, the limited resources we see that ESMA has. So this is not a perfect comparison. The functions of our national regulator, the FCA, and ESMA are by no means identical. But when we see that last year ESMA was operating on a budget of €34 million, in comparison to the FCA's, which was nearly at 500 million, we see that the limited resources are going to be impeding ESMA's ability to perform its role effectively and to be able to then take on future tasks. And both the Commission and the IMF have acknowledged that the budgets of the ESAs have increased over time, but they're probably not proportionate to the increasing workload. So the suggestion is that ESMA may well need a bigger budget envelope. And ESMA's actual funding sources are relevant here as well. So all three of the ESAs are funded by a subsidy from the EU as well as a national regulatory contribution. But ESMA is also received some of its funding from industry fee levies that are levied on the CRAs and the trade repositories. Nevertheless, when we think about particularly the funding that comes from the EU and the national regulator, concerns have been raised, including that ESMA's independence could be undermined by the role of both the Commission and the national regulator in financing it. And further, as ESMA grows and expands, this contribution from the national regulator could become a big burden, especially for small member states, which could create a risk of non-payment. So the Commission has taken the view that further analysis should be carried out. So it suggested that, for instance, we could try and increase the amount of industry fee funding that ESMA receives. But then we get into the question of, well, we might end up with double charges. So market actors could be funding both their own national regulator and ESMA. On the other hand, though, as I noted on the previous slide, the national regulator and ESMA's functions are not identical, so it could perhaps be feasible to try and introduce some type of dual system here going forward. The second stumbling block relates to fiscal concerns. As I touched on at the start of the presentation, the concern here is that if it's the member state and the national taxpayer footing the bill if a market actor fails, this re-enhances arguments in favour of keeping supervision at the national level. And although the CRAs and the TRs were unlikely to be a source or concern of fiscal risk, this is a major hurdle to any future transfer of powers to ESMA going forward. And this is very much interwoven with the current political climate that we see at the moment. So before the Brexit vote in the summer, we saw that there was a Five Presidents report that came out that made some hints towards there being a type of single EU capital markets supervisor. This was firmly batted back by the House of Lords at the start of this year, however, who was far less effusive, basically saying that the UK had previously opposed any such development. However, of course, we're now in a sort of new era, really. So we now have to reflect on this in the light of the UK's vote over the summer. And this somewhat goes without saying that it's likely that the UK's ability, certainly looking at how things are playing out at the moment, that the UK's ability to influence matters, EU matters, is going to be curtailed. And that then means that the interests of other member states, particularly those with major financial centres such as France and Germany, their interests may start to dominate proceedings, which could lead to the revival of more interventionist policies down the line. This could therefore potentially lead to greater centralisation of the EU's markets, plus a greater role for supervisory integration. And coming back then to the third stumbling block, Moroni, in the event that a unanimous treaty vote was required for these changes ever to become a reality without the UK's dissenting voice, in principle it might be possible now to pass such a vote under the treaty provision Article 352. So to wrap up then, to finish on a fairly positive note, it's true to say that ESMA somewhat seized the day with its new role as a direct watchdog with respect to the CRAs and the TRs and the related shifts we've seen with short selling and other related developments. It's building this reputation as a type of credible supervisor who wants to try and drive change. We've seen there's a number of hurdles to future transfers of power to ESMA, but arguably ESMA is also uniquely positioned to be able to develop a type of European approach to supervision. And with this brave, unexpected new European dawn on the horizon, it may be optimistic that perhaps a single European capital markets watchdog is no longer just a pipe dream. Thank you.